Looking around the village today, it's difficult to realise just how busy Knowshill has been in the past, especially in Victorian times. So I'd like to tell you something about Knowshill's bygone industries. And I want to start 200 years ago in the early 1800s. This is a map of the village from the 1830s. Notice that there's no canal and there's no railway. This is the main road from Stafford to Newport. Employment at the village at that time would have been mostly agricultural based. Farmers, farm labourers, waggoners, etc. Plus supporting trades such as blacksmiths and wheelwrights. However, around the end of the 1700s in Stafford, William Horton, whose father was a shoemaker, set up a shoemaking factory. This is Chetwynd House, later to become Stafford Post Office and then a restaurant. It's where William Horton lived. He's generally regarded as the founder of Stafford's 19th century shoe trade. He built a warehouse on Mill Street at the rear of Chetwynd House, and here workers cut out leather parts. Outworkers would collect these shoe parts, assemble them in their own homes and return the completed shoes to the warehouse to be paid and to collect more leather. Census records from the 1800s indicate a number of shoemakers lived in Knowshill. At its busiest time, Horton employed over 1,000 outworkers. So if you didn't like farming, you could become a shoemaker, and many in the village did. Back in Knowshill, we know that there were deposits of brick-making clay in the area, and there were a few brickworks in the early 1800s. But brick-making needs a lot of fuel to fire the kilns, and also transporting clay and bricks would have been a problem. The only way of moving bulk items would have been by road, and this was both time-consuming and expensive. A horse and cart would be limited to just a couple of tons. There was a 5-mile private canal which ran from the coal pits at Donington Wood, owned by Earl Gower. It went as far as Pave Lane on the Wolverhampton to Newport Turnpike Road, and it was completed about 1767, although final delivery to Knowshill would have had to still be made by road. But in the 1830s, the Birmingham-Liverpool Canal was being built, later renamed the Shropshire Union. It opened on the 2nd of March 1835, and it came right into the village. This shows the rate of 1 penny per tonne per mile for most goods and half price for lime. It provided a link from the River Mersey to Ellesmere Port down to the Staffordshire-Worcestershire Canal 65 miles away at Alderley. This is the route going down past Chester, Nantwich, Market Drayton, Norbury and down to Knowshill. And it included a link from the Shrewsbury Canal at Wappenshaw to Norbury, carrying coal and limestone from the Wellington area. The canal had a big impact on Knowshill. That horse, which could only move a couple of tons by road, could now pull more than 20 or 30 tons and over long distances on the canal. The Staffordshire-Worcestershire Canal passed near the Cannock area coalfields, so now more coal could also be transported the 18 miles to Knowshill. So plenty of fuel is now available for brick making and for firing steam engines, which are now being used more commonly to provide power for industry in the mid-1800s. This is part of the 1838 tithe map. And this highlighted property, where Waterside Court is now, was described as a coal, wharf and basin house and owned and run by the Lilleshall Company. They were there just after the canal opened and were probably one of the first companies to bring bulk goods into Knowshill. In 1841, Mary Whittingham was living there. Although the census is difficult to read, it looks like her occupation is wharfinger. So she was probably running it for the Lilleshall Company, and later on the 1851 census she's described as a coal dealer. And there's a cottage and a warehouse. Moving ahead another 10 years, on the 1861 census, Henry Belcher, local man, was a coal merchant here. Over a period of time his business expanded. He built Wharf House where he lived. He also built the steam sawmills and became a timber, coal, salt and lime merchant. He had wood turning and brick making businesses. He was a bandware manufacturer, and he was also a softwood timber importer, receiving deliveries on the canal from Ellesmere Port, and had a steam-driven travelling crane which carried the timber from the canal to the sawmills. And 2 teams of horses pulled heavy loads around the yard. There were canal or railway wharfs at Newport, Shebden, Norbury, Goulston, Hodnet, Horton, Stafford and Penkridge. When he started in the 1850s, he employed just one man, John Barrett, and 20 years later 120 men and boys worked for him. So he was a major employer in the village. He bought 2 John Fowler steam traction engines in 1875 and in 1876. This is a request for a licence in 1883 to use one of them for hauling timber from Shropshire into Nosal. And this is a photograph of a Fowler engine from that time. The John Fowler archives have revealed that the 1876 engine was a ploughing engine rather than just a road locomotive, suggesting that the winding drum underneath could have been used to haul timber from woodland. Then in 1887 there was a disastrous fire which completely destroyed the works. An indication of what was being produced came in a newspaper report about the fire, which read, "One fortunate incident in connection with the event was the fact that an order for several tons of broom heads was completed and dispatched on the previous day." The factory was rebuilt and the brickmaking business expanded, and clay was quarried from the other side of the canal. In an interview with Herringbrook head teacher Mr. G back in 1975, one Nosal resident recalls seeing tubs of clay pulled on trucks on rails across a bridge over the canal to Belcher's brickyard. He got permission from the railway company in 1883 to build the bridge and paid £1 per annum for it. Henry and his wife Mary retired to the Isle of Wight in 1895 for health reasons. This silver tray was presented to him by his employees. The inscription reads, "Presented to Mr. H. Belcher by the employees H. Belcher and Son as a small token of their goodwill. September 1895. In 1901, Henry's son, Henry Michael Belcher, was at the Wharf House. And this is a brick bearing Henry Michael Belcher's initials, HMB. Then in 1908, the wharf yard and house was sold to Alfred Lees, and in a survey later on dated November 1911, it states, "The detached residence with garden and paddock, long canal frontage, outbuildings, warehouses and old brick-making buildings, kilns and plant were void on inspection." And this is a detailed drawing from that 1911 survey. A change of subject now, but as you'll see we'll come back to Nosal Wharf. In the early 1900s lots of milk was produced in the Staffordshire area. Frank Gilbert from Derby set up contracts with farmers for them to deliver milk to factories in Staffordshire and Derbyshire. And he had a condensed milk factory at Woods Eaves managed by George Woodfield. In 1911 he secured a contract to supply milk to the new Cadbury factory at Knighton, where they converted milk and cocoa powder into chocolate chip. This is the Cadbury factory at Knighton. With one of Gilbert's boats. Back in Nosal, 2 years later, in 1913, Frank Gilbert rented the old Belcher premises at the wharf and moved from his Woods Eaves factory and started collecting milk from alongside the canal, pasteurising it at the wharf yard, presumably using the old steam boilers to generate the required processing heat, and delivered the pasteurised milk to Cadbury's using 2 boats, each capable of carrying 2,000 gallons. This photo was taken at the old Belcher warehouse. In 1918 he bought the Nosal Wharf. Some of the surplus milk was sent away by train and some used at the wharf yard for cheese making. George Woodfield managed the creamery, manufacturing Derby, Cheshire and cheddar cheese. A byproduct of cheese manufacture is whey. In the early 1900s, the easiest method of disposal was as pig feed. Consequently, a piggery was established at the wharf site with 600 animals. This was managed by Lewis Palmer. When mature, the pigs were driven down Cross Street and Newport Road to the railway sidings for loading and dispatch to Marsh and Baxter's. Maybe that's why Cross Street, shown here in red, was known as Pig Alley. Gilbert closed the factory in 1923. Then 10 years later, he sold the site in 1933 to Great Western Metropolitan Dairy of Newport, which later became part of United Dairies. The site was sold in 1934 for £1,275 to Staffordshire County Council, and it became Nosal Highway Depot. The site was later closed and developed to become residential properties. So let's now move a few hundred yards along the canal to Coton Mill. This was a steam-powered mill opposite the Navigation pub, and this photograph is from the middle of the 20th century. And the very end part of the building wasn't from the original build, so this is what it probably looked like originally. The mill was supposedly built in 1833 by William Wilder, a farmer from nearby Plardywick. However, new information now shows this is probably most unlikely. The earliest mention of Coton Mill that can be found is from a sales advert dated the 27th of December 1845. The advert states that the mill is in the occupation of Charles Madeley, though it doesn't name him as the owner. Then in December 1848, the property is advertised to be let by the owner Amos Tompkinson. 2 years later, in 1850, his widow Sarah is trying to let the premises. The 2 pairs of French stones were quartz from the Marne Valley in northern France for fine grinding, presumably for flour, and the 1 pair of Derbyshire stones for coarse grains such as barley. On the 1851 census, William Wilder from Plardywick is described as a miller and a farmer, so maybe he was the one who rented or bought the mill from Mrs. Tompkinson. We do know that he did own it 14 years later in 1865 because it was left in his will to his son James. This is James Wilder's obituary from when he died in 1890. Besides Coton Mill, he also owned a rolling mill and steam bakery in Austin Friars in Stafford. I've been told a few times that self-raising flour was first invented in Nosal. That seems highly unlikely. However, the obituary states that James Wilder's business prospered largely to the volume of trade by the introduction of self-raising flour. The mill operated until 1898. This 1900 map confirms that 2 years later it was disused. The property was known to be rented by Sheaf and Kemp, grocers from Stafford, in 1896, though there's no indication that they were ever millers. You can just see the MP from Kemp on the wall. They were there in 1910 when the property survey shows the old flour mill now disused. Joseph Walwyn managed the shop for Sheaf and Kemp, and he bought the premises from the Wilder family in February 1914 for £500. This later photograph shows part of the name Walwyn and indicates his other shop in the High Street. This is one of Walwyn's flour bags. Joseph Walwyn never produced flour, just repackaged it. The business was passed to his son Walter in 1943, and the property was sold in 1978 and became a private residence. At the rear of the mill, alongside the road to Norbury, was this building. It was used as a storeroom by Mr. Walwyn and where he garaged his car. But in the 1950s, it was where Wally Hayden ran his printing business from. This is part of the tithe map from 1838. Notice Coton Mill is not shown. Charles Madeley lived in Mill Lane about 200 metres away from Coton Mill. This is the area that he owned and occupied. In 1848 he was selling this lot, 2 newly erected houses, a blacksmith shop and a brickyard. If his name sounds familiar, he was the one selling Coton Mill 3 years earlier. He also built Morton School in 1846. It appears he was a builder of some note. You can see that the advert makes the point about adjoining the canal and where coal is delivered at a low rate. It's not certain if this is the same place where Charles Madeley lived in 1838, but it is known that Henry Newton had moved there by 1855 and became a cement manufacturer. He was born in Derbyshire, and his father was described as a plaster merchant and a farmer. It appears there are very strong family links between the Newton family and a family called Statons. Henry's mother was Staton, and his sister Catherine married John Staton, who were in partnership with Henry's brother William, mining alabaster at Hanbury in Derbyshire. When William died, one of Henry's sons continued the partnership. In later years, the alabaster business was sold to Gyprock Limited, who continue today with the manufacture of plaster products. Back in Nosal, Henry Newton established the cement works along Mill Lane. This map of 1880 shows the cement works owned by Henry Newton and later his son George. And this picture was taken from the towpath opposite the Boat Inn and shows the lime kilns and a very tall chimney. The alabaster decoration around the font in St. Lawrence Church was a gift from Henry Newton in 1886. Also in St. Lawrence Church, the names of the 52 men connected with the village who fell in the First World War are inscribed on an alabaster tablet. Another gift from the Newton family. Henry died in 1902. Cement manufacture stopped by 1910 and the works was used by George Newton as a builder's merchant. The area is now residential canal-side property. This is the area now occupied by Glendower Close. And this is what the old map would have looked like with Glendower Close overlaid onto it. But in 1880, the site was Henry Fowle and Sons Brickworks. It was started by his father Richard in 1820 and it closed in 1920. And this is Henry Fowle. And one of his bricks stamped H. Fowle and Son, Nosal. The finished bricks would probably be taken to this canal wharf along the road to Norbury. Besides the Glendower site, Henry also had another brickworks. So we go down the canal, past Belcher's timber yard, through the Cowley Tunnel to the Cowley Brickworks. The works was on land above the canal, but there's little evidence of it there now. Henry leased the canal spoil banks from the Shropshire Union Canal Company. He built a wharf 8 metres long with a ramp up to the brickworks and laid rails to carry trucks. According to Shropshire Union Committee minutes of March 1887, part of a spoil bank at Grub Street, 5 miles away, west of Woods Eaves, was let to Mr. Fowle for him to make a wharf for himself and to take clay to the Cowley Brickworks. In an interview with Heronbrook head teacher, Harold Fowle, one of Henry's sons, describes the brickmaking process, and I'm quoting, "Henry employed 4 or 5 men at Cowley during the brickmaking season in the autumn and winter months, and during the summer just one man, Bert Rhodes. He overhauled the machinery and dug clay in the clay pits, presumably from the Grub Street site, and put it ready in heaps at the foot of the inclined plane, ready for brickmaking. When the season began, the steam engine would draw trucks of clay up the ramp from where workmen at the top picked out stones and pebbles from the clay as it was shoveled onto a moving belt which carried it through 3 sets of rollers. From the last set it was forced through a wooden box mould, from where it emerged as a continuous rectangular sausage. Henry Fowle cut the clay with a wire into bricks which were barrowed away to an open space where they were stacked and covered to protect them from the rain and left for 2 weeks to dry out. They were then put into one of 2 kilns. One made 10,000 bricks and the other 16,000 bricks per firing, which took about a week overall. Unless for local use, the finished bricks were lowered down the ramp to the wharf in trucks and transferred onto one of 2 boats that Henry owned. Bricks made at Cowley were stamped with HFG, meaning Henry Fowle, Nosal. But some didn't always come out right. Before we move away from the canal, it's worth noting its importance in moving raw materials, fuel and finished goods. There was Fowle's Wharf alongside the Norbury Road, Coton Mill opposite the Navigation Inn, Newton Cement Works between the Navigation and the boat bridges, Belcher Steam Sawmills where the Waterside Court is today, and Cowley Brickworks. all of them providing employment for the villagers, and mostly thanks to the canal. The 1880 map also shows old brick kilns alongside the Stafford Road. And if you went up the road to Knightley, then turn right at the junction and travel along towards Great Bridgeford, you'd come across a brick field at Lawnhead. And as a bonus, there was also a saw pit nearby. Although most of the industry was at the Nosal Heath part of the village, near to the canal and railway, school furniture was manufactured at premises along Aldmore Road. This is the 1920 map showing the location of Ashbrook Cottage. The factory known as the Anchor Works was shown here circled in red. These buildings were used in the late 1800s by Henry Addison, where he made church school furniture. This is Ashbrook Cottage seen from the junction with Aldmore and Knightley roads. Henry Addison bought Ashbrook Cottage in 1881 and traded as H&S Addison, suggested he was in partnership with his father, Samuel, who was a joiner and licensee of the Duke's Head. Henry was at Ashbrook Cottage until 1899. This is one of the workshops. I should imagine that the chimney on the left would have been above the forge where the metal hinges and fittings were made. And this is a bench manufactured by him. He moved his business to the Waterloo Works in Wellington and traded as H. Addison & Co, as seen by the ironwork on this bench. He even had his own Addison inkwells. This one's from Nosal and another from when he moved to Wellington. This is Nosal's fish and chip shop, but it used to be the office of John Liversidge. He used the railway sidings for sales of coal, lime and salt. Notice his telephone number, Nosal 7. He also had an office at the entrance to the railway sidings. Then later he started to sell other fuels and fertilisers. And this one, even later, in 1950, shows that Wheaton Kirby had bought his business. And this is the area by the railway goods yard. Later it became Swinnerton's Garden Centre, and it's now Stacey's Gardens. Across the road was Stacey's timber yard, run by Ben Stacey and his son Frank. Frank Stacey married Amy Rose, daughter of the police sergeant Rose. She kept the sweet shop in the high street called Old Stacey's. Frank Stacey and his wife had a tennis court in the field about here. And this photograph was taken on the tennis courts looking towards the station. The important part of this photograph is the background of the picture, which shows a corrugated iron workshop indicated with this arrow. The survey of 1910 shows it had 2 steam saws. And behind the workshop was a brick-built office. The office is shown here in blue. It was later used as a cobbler's, then as a newsagent's, before it was taken down to road level, and this is what can be seen of it now. Just a short distance from Stacey's timber yard is Williecroft, built about 1902 for Dr. Steele. Dr. Steele's first wife was the daughter of the Reverend John Till, vicar of St. Lawrence Church, but she died in 1897. And in 1902, Dr. Steele married Edith Evans, whose family ran a general store in Newport called the Ark Stores. In May 1916, Dr. Steele, his wife Edith and her brother Algernon formed a partnership making soft toys. The business was called Stevens Manufacturing Company Limited, previously called the Model Rifle and Walking Toy Manufacturers. The name Stevens is derived from the family names of Steele and Evans, although Mr. Evans played little part in running the business. This wooden building was erected and used as the doll factory. The wide variety of toys produced was reputedly of high quality, and the company patented a mechanism in 1916 for a hopping rabbit. This is a local advert from 1916, and from a catalogue which shows the range of products. After the First World War, the market was flooded with cheap, high-quality mechanical toys from abroad, and the factory closed in 1922. A few years later, the doll factory building was taken down. We've looked at some of the past industrialists in detail, but here are a few more trades which no longer exist in the village. There were many blacksmiths in the village, especially in Victorian times. Dick Hall was a blacksmith at the top of the High Street, as shown here in red, and the Beach family were blacksmiths near the Boat Inn. James Murray was a barrel maker at this property in the High Street. John Malpas was a wheelwright down Back Lane. He became a funeral director with his son-in-law Andrew Walker. And the Grosvenor family of Father Benjamin and sons Richard, Robert and Thomas were prominent wheelwrights in the 1800s. They were at the recent post office for at least 40 years. In fact, the junction of High Street and Salmon Street was known to many as Grosvenor Square. So hopefully that has provided an insight into Nostral's industrial past.